Dawn breaks over the St. Quentin Canal on the 29th of September 1918. Dense fog rolls across the battlefield, so thick a man cannot see 10 feet ahead. Somewhere in that mist, soldiers from the industrial towns of England are strapping lifebelts around their chests. Lifebelts taken from channel steamers. They are about to do something their commanders consider impossible. They are about to swim across a fortress. Behind them, 945,000 shells have fallen in the last 24 hours. Ahead of them stands the Hindenburg Line, Germany's last and greatest defensive system. The Germans call it impregnable. In a few minutes, these men will prove them wrong. But the story of how an army of factory workers came to swim across Germany's final fortress begins not here. It begins 7 weeks earlier, on the day that broke the German army's soul. By the spring of 1918, the Great War had ground on for nearly 4 years. Millions were dead, the Western Front had barely moved, and Germany was running out of time. In March, the German High Command launched its final desperate gamble. They called it the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. Russia had surrendered, freeing 50 divisions from the Eastern Front. American troops were pouring into France by the hundreds of thousands. If Germany was going to win, it had to happen now, before those fresh American soldiers could tip the balance. The spring offensive nearly succeeded. German stormtroopers smashed through Allied lines, advancing 40 miles in places. Paris came within range of German artillery. For a few breathless weeks, it seemed the war might end with a German victory. But by July, the offensive had collapsed under its own weight. The German army suffered nearly 1 million casualties in 4 months of attacking. Their best troops, the elite stormtroopers who led every assault, died in disproportionate numbers. The front line stretched from 390 kilometers to 510, more territory to defend with fewer men to hold it. Meanwhile, 1.4 million American soldiers had arrived in France, with more coming every week. The window for German victory had closed. What the German High Command did not yet understand was how fast the end would come. The man who would orchestrate that end was Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the French general appointed Supreme Allied Commander in the desperate days of March 1918. Foch had one philosophy, and he repeated it constantly: attack, attack, attack. He believed that relentless pressure, applied simultaneously across the entire front, would prevent the Germans from shifting reserves to meet any single threat. Hit them everywhere, give them no time to recover. His strategy would become known as the Grand Offensive. But Foch needed commanders who could execute attacks unlike anything the war had seen. He found them in the Dominion forces. Lieutenant General Sir John Monash commanded the Australian Corps. A Jewish civil engineer from Melbourne, Monash was an outsider in every sense. He faced anti-Semitism from war correspondents who tried to have him removed from command just weeks before his greatest triumph. But Field Marshal Montgomery would later call him the best general on the Western Front, and Monash earned that assessment through meticulous innovation. Monash believed that a modern battle should unfold like an orchestral composition. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft were instruments that had to play in perfect coordination. No element could succeed alone. Every arm of the military had to support the others in precise synchronization. At the Battle of Hamel on the 4th of July, Monash proved his theory worked. His forces achieved every objective in 93 minutes with minimal casualties. It was a small battle, but it demonstrated what combined arms warfare could accomplish. Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie commanded the Canadian Corps. A former insurance salesman and militia officer, Currie had risen through ability alone. He was a master of what soldiers called set-piece battles, meticulously planned assaults that left nothing to chance. Currie was known for bold decisions that terrified his superiors, and for the absolute trust his men placed in him. When other generals called his plan suicidal, Currie proceeded anyway. He was usually right. Together, the Australian and Canadian Corps would serve as the shock troops of the British Army, spearheading the most difficult attacks of the campaign to come. Opposing them was General Erich Ludendorff, the first quartermaster general and de facto commander of the German army. Ludendorff was the architect of the spring offensive, the man who had come within miles of winning the war. Now he faced the consequences of that gamble's failure. His army was exhausted. His best troops were dead. The British naval blockade had caused food shortages that weakened both soldiers and civilians. The Spanish influenza was spreading through the ranks, with as many as 1 million German soldiers too sick to fight. Fresh replacements, young and inexperienced, were being called war prolongers by the cynical veterans who had survived 4 years of slaughter. Behind Ludendorff's battered front lines stood the Hindenburg Line. Built between 1916 and 1917, it stretched 90 miles from Arras to Soissons. Multiple trench systems, concrete machine gun emplacements, reverse slope positions invisible to artillery observers, and belts of barbed wire 50 yards deep made it the most formidable defensive system in military history. The southern sector incorporated the St. Quentin Canal as a natural anti-tank obstacle, its banks rising over 50 feet in places. German soldiers were told this was where they would hold. There was nothing behind them. If the Hindenburg Line fell, the war was lost. In early August, the Allies prepared to test that assumption. Foch planned a massive attack east of the city of Amiens. The assault would be led by the British Fourth Army under General Sir Henry Rawlinson, with the Australian and Canadian Corps forming the spearhead. The objective was simple: smash the German Second Army and begin the long push toward the Hindenburg Line. The preparations were conducted in absolute secrecy. The Canadian Corps moved 50 miles by night. During the day, they hid. Fake radio traffic suggested they were in Flanders, 100 miles to the north. German intelligence was completely fooled. 530 tanks, the largest armored force ever assembled, concentrated behind the lines. 2,000 artillery pieces were brought forward. 800 aircraft prepared to support the assault. Most importantly, there would be no preliminary bombardment. Previous offensives had announced themselves, with days of shelling that warned the enemy an attack was coming and churned the ground into impassable mud. This time, the first shells would fall at 0 hour, the same moment the infantry began to advance. The Germans suspected nothing. Some units in the sector were resting, their defenses thinly manned. Their commanders believed the front was quiet. On the night of the 7th of August, Australian gunner J.R. Armitage lay in position, waiting. In his diary, he described an eerie stillness. Vehicles made no sound on the marshy ground. Drivers whispered to their horses. Men muttered curses under their breath. The silence played on their nerves. But they could feel that hundreds of groups of men were doing the same thing, preparing for the heaviest barrage ever launched. At 4:19 on the morning of August 8th, watches were synchronized across the front. Dense fog had begun to settle over no man's land. Tank engines rumbled, their noise masked by aircraft flying overhead, another of Monash's innovations. At 4:20, over 2,000 Allied guns opened fire simultaneously. Armitage wrote that all hell broke loose and they heard nothing more. The world was enveloped in sound and flame, and their ears simply could not cope. The German army was about to experience what Ludendorff would call the Black Day. The barrage erupted without warning. German soldiers jolted awake in their dugouts to the thunder of 2,000 guns firing simultaneously. There had been no preliminary bombardment, no days of shelling to signal an attack was coming. One moment, silence. The next, the earth itself seemed to convulse. Through the dense morning fog, 530 tanks emerged like phantoms. Behind them came the infantry, advancing in coordination with a creeping barrage that moved forward in precise increments, keeping the Germans pinned in their shelters. Aircraft roared overhead, strafing positions and dropping supplies to advancing units. It was combined arms warfare on a scale never before attempted. The German defenders never had a chance to organize resistance. Many were captured before they could reach their weapons. Some surrendered in their underwear, dragged from sleep into captivity. Whole formations threw down their arms without firing a shot. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing the scale of the disaster unfolding across the German front. The Australian Corps advanced 11 kilometers on the first day. The Canadian Corps pushed forward 13 kilometers along a 16-kilometer front. A gap 15 miles wide had been punched through the German lines. In a war that measured progress in yards gained per month, this was unprecedented. The human cost of that first day told the story in brutal arithmetic. German casualties reached 30,000, with 12,000 of those taken prisoner. Allied losses were approximately 6,500. The ratio was almost unthinkable. For every Allied soldier killed or wounded, nearly 5 Germans had fallen or surrendered. But it was not the territory lost or the casualties suffered that shattered Ludendorff. It was the nature of the collapse. German soldiers were not supposed to surrender en masse. The German army did not simply stop fighting. Yet here were reports of entire units laying down their weapons, of officers unable to rally their men, of veterans who had survived 4 years of war walking toward the enemy with their hands raised. When Ludendorff received the reports, he broke down. He would later write that August 8th was the black day of the German army in the history of the war. This was the worst experience he had to go through. Crucially, his despair focused not on ground lost, but on what the mass surrenders revealed. Something had broken in the German soldiers' will to fight. The army he had commanded to within miles of victory in the spring was disintegrating before his eyes. 2 days later, on the 10th of August, Kaiser Wilhelm II met with Ludendorff at German headquarters. The Kaiser's words were blunt. "We have reached the limits of our capacity. The war must be ended." For the first time, the German head of state acknowledged what the Black Day had made obvious. Victory was no longer possible. But Wilhelm was not ready to surrender. He insisted that Germany must achieve some military success before seeking peace, something to improve their negotiating position. The Kaiser knew the war was lost. He simply could not bring himself to stop fighting, and so the killing continued. The Allies faced their own crisis in the days following August 8th. The spectacular advances of the first day began to slow. Troops outran their supplies. Artillery could not be moved forward fast enough to support continued attacks. German reserves arrived to plug the gaps in their lines, and resistance stiffened. By the third day, the offensive was grinding to a halt. This was the familiar pattern of the war. Every previous breakthrough had followed the same trajectory. Initial success, slowing momentum, and then months of futile attacks against reorganized defenses. The Somme in 1916 had begun with promise and devolved into 4 months of slaughter for minimal gains. Passchendaele in 1917 had cost hundreds of thousands of lives to advance 5 miles through mud. The instinct of commanders was always to press forward, to exploit success, to keep attacking until the enemy broke. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, faced a choice. He could continue the Amiens offensive, throwing more men against stiffening resistance in the hope of achieving a decisive breakthrough. This was what previous doctrine demanded. This was what Foch wanted. Haig refused. On the 15th of August, when Foch demanded that the Amiens attack continue, Haig pushed back. The offensive had achieved its objectives. Continuing would only waste lives. Instead, Haig ordered preparations for a new attack further north, at Albert. When resistance hardened in one sector, he would shift the blow elsewhere. This was revolutionary. It seems obvious in retrospect, but no commander had consistently applied this principle before. The Allies had learned, finally, that it was better to turn a line than to try to roll over it. Rather than battering against prepared defenses, they would probe for weakness, exploit success, and move on before the enemy could recover. This philosophy would define the 100 Days. The results were immediate. On the 21st of August, the British Third Army attacked at Albert, catching the Germans off balance. The town fell the next day. By the 26th, the First Army had widened the assault at Arras. Bapaume fell on the 29th. The German Second Army was pushed back 55 kilometers across a broad front. Unable to hold their advanced positions, the Germans began retreating toward the Hindenburg Line. On the 2nd of September, German High Command issued orders to withdraw to those prepared defenses. The territory gained in the spring offensive, purchased with nearly 1 million casualties, was abandoned in days. 40 miles of hard-won ground given up without a fight. As the retreat continued, the scale of Allied success became clear. In the 4 weeks following August 8th, over 100,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. The British Expeditionary Force alone captured 30,441 in the last week of September. Equipment was abandoned across the front. Guns, ammunition, supplies, all left behind by an army that could no longer hold its ground. By early September, the German army had been pushed back to its final fortress. The Hindenburg Line stretched 90 miles across northern France, anchored on concrete fortifications in the formidable obstacle of the St. Quentin Canal. German soldiers took their positions in defenses prepared over 2 years, the strongest the Western Front had ever seen. Allied commanders studied the obstacle before them. Previous attacks on the Hindenburg Line had failed. The defenses were deep, the positions expertly sighted, the obstacles seemingly impassable. The canal alone presented a challenge unlike anything the Allies had faced. Crossing it under fire appeared impossible. But the Allies had learned something in those August weeks. They had seen an army that no longer believed it could win. They had watched tens of thousands of German soldiers choose captivity over continued resistance. They had broken what the Germans considered unbreakable before. Now they prepared to do it again. The Hindenburg Line was not a single trench, but a fortress zone nearly 4 miles deep. Multiple defensive positions layered behind one another, each designed to slow and bleed any attacking force. Concrete machine gun emplacements dotted the landscape, their fields of fire interlocking to create kill zones that no infantry could survive. Barbed wire stretched in belts 50 yards wide. Artillery was pre-registered on every approach. The Germans had spent 2 years perfecting these defenses, and they believed no army on earth could break them. The southern sector presented the greatest challenge. Here, the St. Quentin Canal served as a massive anti-tank ditch, its brick-lined walls rising over 50 feet in places. The canal was 35 meters wide and 15 meters deep, filled with water that would swallow any soldier who fell. Near the village of Bellecourt, the canal ran underground through a tunnel stretching 6,000 yards. German troops used this tunnel as a shelter, capable of housing an entire division safe from artillery fire. They could emerge fresh and ready to fight after any bombardment ended. German commanders assured their men that this position was impregnable. There was nothing behind them. If they held here, Germany might still negotiate a peace. If they failed, the war was lost. The soldiers took their positions and waited for the attack they knew was coming. Marshal Foch planned to hit the Hindenburg Line from multiple directions simultaneously. On the 26th of September, French and American forces would launch the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the south. On the 27th, the Canadian Corps would attack at the Canal du Nord. On the 28th, Belgian and British forces would strike at Ypres. On the 29th, the main assault would fall on the St. Quentin Canal sector. The Germans would face pressure across the entire front, unable to shift reserves to meet any single threat. The Canal du Nord presented its own impossible obstacle. The waterway was dry, but surrounded by deliberately flooded marshland. Only a narrow stretch of 2,700 yards near Inchy-en-Artois remained passable. Any attack would have to funnel through this bottleneck, concentrating forces in a confined space where German artillery could slaughter them. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie studied the problem and proposed a solution that horrified his superiors. He would push 50,000 men through that narrow gap, then fan out on the far side to attack across a 10,000-yard front. His commanders called the plan suicidal. Concentrating so many troops in such a small space invited catastrophe. A single, well-placed barrage could destroy the entire assault force. Currie insisted. He had calculated the risks. Speed and surprise would carry his men through the bottleneck before the Germans could react. Once across, the Canadian Corps would overwhelm the defenders before they could organize resistance. Field Marshal Haig was asked to overrule Currie. He refused. Haig had learned to trust the Canadian commander's judgment, even when the odds seemed impossible. At 5:20 on the morning of September 27th, 785 Canadian guns opened fire. 4 battalions from the 1st and 4th Divisions scrambled down into the dry canal bed and began crossing. Engineers threw portable bridges across obstacles while machine gun fire crackled overhead. 15 tanks joined the push, their treads grinding through the narrow corridor. The Germans were stunned by the speed of the assault. By 9:15, barely 4 hours after the attack began, the canal was secured. The 4th Division captured Bourlon Wood, a position that had resisted British attacks for a year. The Marcoing line, bristling with machine gun nests, was overrun by nightfall. Currie's impossible gamble had succeeded, but the breakthrough came at a price. Over the 4 days of fighting around Canal du Nord, the Canadian Corps suffered more than 10,000 casualties. The Germans fought with desperate fury, knowing what the loss of these positions meant. Yet they could not hold. The Canadians pushed forward relentlessly, and by the 30th of September, they had reached the outskirts of Cambrai. As the Canal du Nord attack unfolded, 4 factors converged on Erich Ludendorff. Bulgaria, Germany's ally in the Balkans, had requested a ceasefire. Allied forces were advancing across the entire Western Front. German reserves were exhausted, with no fresh troops available to plug the gaps. And the reports from his commanders made clear that further sacrifice would achieve nothing. On the 28th of September, Ludendorff suffered a nervous breakdown. Witnesses described him railing at his staff without cause, publicly accusing Hindenburg of talking nonsense, and at times bursting into tears. The man who had nearly won the war in the spring could no longer function. He told Hindenburg that the situation of the army demands an immediate armistice in order to save a catastrophe. For the first time, the German High Command formally acknowledged that the war must end. But the fighting was not over. The main assault on the Hindenburg Line would fall the next day, on the 29th of September, against the strongest sector of all. The task of crossing the St. Quentin Canal fell to the 46th North Midland Division, territorial soldiers from the industrial towns of England. These were not elite troops. They had suffered terribly at Gaumecourt on the first day of the Somme in 1916, and some commanders questioned whether they had the offensive spirit for such an assault. Many in the division believed they were being sent on a sacrificial stunt. The preparations defied belief. Royal Engineers gathered 3,000 lifebelts from cross-channel steamers and distributed them to the assault troops. Scaling ladders and improvised floating piers were constructed to help men climb the canal's steep brick walls. The artillery bombardment lasted 56 hours, with 945,052 shells fired in the final 24 hours alone, a British record. Over 30,000 mustard gas shells targeted German headquarters and artillery positions. At 5:50 on the morning of September 29th, the 137th Brigade left their trenches 3,000 yards from the canal. Brigadier General John Vaughan Campbell, who already held the Victoria Cross for valor at the Somme, led his men forward, blowing a hunting horn. Dense fog obscured the battlefield. The creeping barrage kept German defenders pinned in their dugouts as the territorials advanced. When they reached the canal, the men plunged in. Some swam, others waded through chest-deep water. The lifebelts kept the non-swimmers afloat as they pulled themselves across .830. Sappers worked frantically to get portable bridges in place, while machine gun fire raked the water. On the northern edge of the assault, Captain A.H. Charlton led a squad of the 6th North Staffordshire Regiment in a desperate sprint for Requeval Bridge. The Germans had prepared the bridge for demolition, and charges were set to destroy it the moment an attack began. Charlton's men reached the bridge before the Germans could detonate the explosives. They cut the wires and secured the crossing intact. By 8:30, barely 3 hours after the assault began, all objectives had been achieved. The 46th Division had crossed the impassable canal, scaled the impregnable walls, and shattered the Hindenburg Line. Their casualties numbered approximately 800. They had captured 4,200 German prisoners and 70 guns. After the crossing, Campbell assembled his exhausted men on the captured Requeval Bridge. A photographer captured the moment. Soldiers, still wearing lifebelts, stood on the bridge, their enemies had sworn could never be taken, listening as their brigadier addressed them. That photograph became one of the defining images of the First World War, proof that the impossible had become real. Over the following days, Australian and American forces attacked at Bellecourt, pushing through the tunnel sector. Fighting was heavy, and the Americans, inexperienced in this kind of warfare, suffered significant casualties. But by the 5th of October, the Australian Corps had captured the village of Montbretagne in their final action of the war. The Hindenburg Line was completely broken. General Rawlinson surveyed the captured positions and offered a verdict that explained everything. The Hindenburg Line would have been impregnable, he said, if it had been defended by the German army of 2 years earlier. The fortress had not failed. The men defending it had lost the will to hold it. The Hindenburg Line was broken, but the war was not over. German armies retreated through territory they had held since 1914, fighting rearguard actions at every river crossing and defensible village. The Allies pursued relentlessly, giving the enemy no time to establish new defensive positions. Towns and villages that had lived under German occupation for 4 years were liberated in rapid succession. Cambrai fell to the Canadians on the 8th of October, though the Germans left it burning and riddled with booby traps. The textile mills and homes were ablaze as Canadian soldiers picked their way through streets designed to kill them. The retreat accelerated through October. German units abandoned increasing quantities of heavy equipment, unable to move guns and ammunition fast enough to keep ahead of the Allied advance. Morale, already shattered by the Hindenburg Line collapse, continued to disintegrate. Soldiers who had endured 4 years of war saw no purpose in dying for positions that would be abandoned within days. Desertions increased. Units that had fought with distinction since 1914 simply melted away. On the 26th of October, Erich Ludendorff resigned. He had opposed the armistice terms being negotiated with the Allies, insisting that Germany should continue fighting. The government disagreed. The man who had called August 8th the Black Day of the German Army left his command, his reputation in ruins, his army collapsing. He would spend the coming years constructing a lie to explain the defeat, claiming that Germany had not been beaten on the battlefield, but stabbed in the back by Jews, socialists, and war profiteers at home. That lie would poison German politics for a generation. On the 4th of November, British and Commonwealth forces attacked across the Cambrai Canal. Among the casualties was Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, the poet whose verses had captured the horror of the trenches better than any other writer. Owen was killed, leading his men across the canal, 1 week before the armistice. His mother received the telegram announcing his death as church bells rang to celebrate the peace. On the 9th of November, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. Revolution had swept through Germany, with sailors mutinying at Kiel and workers forming councils in major cities. The empire that had dominated Central Europe for half a century collapsed in days. Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands, where he would live in exile until his death in 1941. A republic was proclaimed in Berlin, though no one was quite sure who was in charge. 2 days later, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, German representatives signed the armistice. The time was 5:10 in the morning. The ceasefire would take effect at 1100 hours, nearly 6 hours away. Word began spreading along the front, passed from headquarters to division to regiment to the men in the trenches. The war was ending. In 6 hours, the guns would stop. Those 6 hours became the final tragedy of the 100 days. Many commanders ordered their troops to continue attacking. Some sought to capture ground that might improve their nations, positions in the peace negotiations. Others wanted to end the war on a note of victory, seizing objectives that had resisted capture for years. American Commander General John Pershing had opposed the armistice entirely, arguing that Germany should be forced to surrender unconditionally. His troops continued offensive operations until the final minutes. Artillery batteries kept firing throughout the morning. Some commanders wanted to use up ammunition rather than haul it back from the front. Others simply saw no reason to stop before they had to. The shells continued falling on German positions, killing men who knew the war would end before noon. The cost of those final hours defies comprehension. Approximately 10,944 men became casualties on the 11th of November, 1918. Of those, 2,738 died. More men were killed on the last day of the First World War than on D-Day and the Second. The final casualties left records of individual tragedy that haunted the armies for years. Private Henry Gunther of Baltimore had been a sergeant until a letter home complaining about the war was intercepted by censors. He was demoted to private, and the shame consumed him. On the morning of November 11th, Gunther's unit approached German positions near the village of Chaumont de Vendonvillers. The time was 10:59, 1 minute before the ceasefire. German soldiers, knowing the war was about to end, waved at the Americans to stay back. There was no need for anyone else to die. Gunther charged. His squad mates shouted for him to stop. The Germans waved frantically, trying to warn him away. Gunther kept running, his bayonet fixed, perhaps seeking to redeem himself in the final seconds of the war. A German machine gunner, with no choice left, fired a single burst. Henry Gunther fell dead at 10:59, the last American soldier killed in the First World War. Private George Lawrence Price of the Canadian Corps was shot by a sniper at 10:58 while his unit entered the Belgian town of Ville-sur-Haine. He was the last soldier of the British Empire to die in the war. 2 minutes later, the guns fell silent. The French suffered their own final tragedy. Augustin Tribuchon was a runner carrying a message to the front lines. The message informed the troops that hot soup would be served after the ceasefire. At 10:45, 15 minutes before the war ended, Tribuchon was shot through the head. He was the last French soldier killed in the Great War. His grave marker, like those of many French soldiers who died on November 11th, was dated the 10th of November. The shame of deaths after the armistice was signed proved too great to record honestly. Private George Edwin Ellison of the 5th Royal Irish Lancers fell at 9:30 that morning, the last British soldier to die. By coincidence or design, he was buried in the St. Symphorien Military Cemetery near Mons, just yards from the grave of Private John Parr, the first British soldier killed in August 1914. The bookends of Britain's war lie side by side, separated by 4 years and nearly 1 million British dead. At 1100 hours, the guns stopped. Men who had lived with the constant thunder of artillery for years experienced something they had almost forgotten: silence. Soldiers climbed out of trenches and stood in the open, no longer afraid of snipers or shells. Some wept. Others sat in stunned disbelief. The war that had consumed their youth, killed their friends, and shattered their world was over. The Canadian Corps entered Mons that morning, the town where the British Expeditionary Force had fought its first battle in August 1914. Belgian civilians poured into the streets, embracing the liberating soldiers. Church bells rang. For the first time in 4 years, the Western Front knew peace. The cost of that peace was staggering. The 100 Days Offensive from August 8th to November 11th had produced approximately 1,460,000 casualties. Allied losses approached 700,000, with the British Empire suffering 412,000, the French 279,000, and the Americans 127,000. German casualties exceeded 760,000, with 386,000 taken prisoner. In 95 days, the Allies had broken the Hindenburg Line, shattered German morale, and forced an empire to its knees. They had demonstrated that combined arms warfare could overcome any defensive position, and that an army that loses faith in victory cannot hold even the strongest fortress. The tactical innovations of 1918 would shape military doctrine for the next century, but the victory carried seeds of future catastrophe. Ludendorff's stab-in-the-back myth spread through Germany, convincing millions that their army had never truly been defeated. The Versailles Treaty imposed harsh terms that bred resentment. Marshal Foch studied the peace agreement and delivered a prophecy that would prove grimly accurate. "This is not peace," he said. "It is an armistice for 20 years. He was wrong by only 65 days. The Second World War began 20 years and 65 days after the armistice at Amiens. The railway carriage where Germany signed the 1918 armistice was brought out of a museum in 1940 so that France could sign its surrender to Hitler in the same spot. The men who crossed the St. Quentin Canal wearing lifebelts from Channel steamers achieved what their enemies swore was impossible. They broke the unbreakable line. They ended a war that had consumed 17 million lives and shattered 4 empires. The 100 Days Offensive cost nearly 1.5 million casualties in 3 months of fighting. On the final day alone, 2,738 men died after the armistice had already been signed, killed in the hours between the promise of peace and its arrival. The campaign proved that no fortress can stand when its defenders have lost the will to fight. It showed that tactical innovation, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. And it demonstrated that victory, even total victory, carries a weight that does not lift when the guns fall silent. Those soldiers who survived November 1918 believed they had fought the war to end all wars. They were wrong. 20 years later, their sons would cross other beaches, break other lines, and learn the same bitter lessons their fathers had paid for in blood.